Sorry, everyone, we're a few minutes late. That is totally my time zone error. um, Hopefully, you will bear with me for about 2 seconds while I do a little intro. Today, we are back with Dr. Irina Manea for women in the Viking Age and beyond. We had the idea to learn a little bit more about Valkyries and such after her last master class. So, we're very excited to have her back today. I'm going to skip my little intro, but basically, if you like what you see from SASA, please do check out our website, check out our other live events and other projects that we have to offer. We are a nonprofit. Almost completely run by volunteers. So, really, any donation helps. Following and subscribing to our channels really helps. Sorry, you can search Save Ancient Studies Alliance on basically any platform and follow us there on social media. We do these kinds of live events. We do Archeo Gaming every Friday and Sunday at the moment, have an access database, research project, and much, much more. So please do search for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. And with that very quick intro, I'm going to hand it right over to Irina right away to get started. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. As usual, I am delighted to be able to present with SASA another topic of interest, especially because we celebrated the International Women's Day, or better said, the International Day of Women's Rights. And we'll be discussing today a little bit about the different images and roles of women in the Viking Age and a little bit after the Viking Age, because I will also be referring to Icelandic sagas, and Icelandic sagas were written after conversion. But then again, a lot of the material is still with pagan mentalities, infused with pagan mentalities. So a lot of researchers do use these Icelandic sagas when talking about such topics. So I'm going to be talking about, Valkyries, as already mentioned, but I'm also going to be looking at some other roles women can take in such stories, for example, the inciter, the sorceress, the prophetess, and last but not least, general labor roles. So let's see what that all is about. Well, I'm going to start a little bit with the Valkyrie. So the Valkyrie, as perhaps a lot of you know, they are the choosers of the slain. They work closely with Odin, and they essentially choose the slain from the battlefield and take them to Odin's hall to Valhall. And there we have an elite group of warriors called the Einherjar, and the Einherjar are used by Odin to do battle with him during Ragnarok, during the apocalypse. And we find these figures not only in pagan context, we also find them in Christian context. We have, for example, the poem Håkonarmál, and the outcome of the battle presented in this skaldic poem is determined by two Valkyriur by the name of Gondul and Skogul. So they are perceived as these very powerful women. They are, if you want, an incorporation of Odin's powers as well. And some of these poems are deeply infused with pagan beliefs, although Håkon himself was a Christian. And in skaldic poetry, you have a lot of references to these women. There are references. Using weapon language. For example, they are described as being Odin's maidens. They are the goddesses of the spear. All kinds of metaphors regarding the use of helmets or shields. They're also called victory maidens. Sometimes you are also going to fight swords, being described as being, for example, the fire of Skogul, one of the Valkyries, or the battle being described as the storm of Clock, or the showers of Hrist. So we have a lot of names here as well. If you look on in the sources, you're probably going to find more than 50 names of Valkyriur. I recently made a video about that as well. If you want, feel free to check that out a little later. All right, so in the poem Håkonarmál, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this poem because it's very interesting. It shows on the one hand how excited warriors were to being given this opportunity to continue fighting in the afterlife in the company of women, among other things. So it was something to look forward to, as a matter of fact. But not everyone was so thrilled about it. So in this poem, we have Gondul and Skogul being sent to choose among the kings of Scandinavia. The kin of Yngvi is quoted in the poem, and one of these kings is Håkon, and alongside we also find his retinue. But he is not that thrilled about it. As a matter of fact, he's not that thrilled about going to Valhall, and he complains a little bit at the end of the poem about this, because he says something like, if we were this brave and this courageous, why weren't we allowed to win the battle? Which is a pretty legit question, and the answer resides in the, well, pretty selfish nature of Odin himself, who wants these followers and these warriors for himself, and the ones who perform the task of choosing them are the Valkyriur. Of course, there is here the question: do the Valkyriur just obey Odin, or do they have some kind of agency of their own? And I think this is a relevant question to ask about women in general in the Viking Age and beyond. The question of agency, how much of what women decided was actually their own decision, and how much was it actually obeying what men said and just adapting to the patriarchal society. And I would say that sometimes we do find examples of agency in the case of these mythical women, because, for example, we have the Valkyria Sigurdrifa, later found in sources as Brynhildr, who actually is punished by Odin because she chose a warrior she shouldn't have chosen, or she refused to choose the right one to go to Valhall. Right, and one of the most compelling images we have regarding Valkyriur is the one where we find them weaving, which is not something very common, because we usually associate other female categories with this process of weaving and spinning, both in real life and in mythology. In mythology, for example, we have the Nornir, who are more or less the correspondents of the Pache or Morai in the Greek Roman world. However, this is more likely our attempt to make a categorization among these women, generally speaking, among mythological figures. In the mind of a person living in the 9th or 10th century, they would have been a lot more mixed up. So we have this poem called Dara Daryod, the Song of the Spear, or the Song of Dorother, because it's also the name of the person observing what's going on. Dara Daryod is a poem quoted in the saga of Njol, Brennu Njol saga, and it is towards the end of the saga where we have the context of the Battle of Clontarf having taken place in 1014. But there have been some researchers who analyzed the language, and the poem probably refers to another battle. That's not the point here. The point is that we have an observant, a warrior, and he is noticing in a room, in a weaving room, he spots in Caithness a gruesome imagery. There is a group of women of Valkyriur weaving, and what they weave is actually a metaphor for battle. So let me just quote a little bit from this poem so you can see what it is about. So Sjoer Orpin Veffer, the fabric is warped, Ita Thormum, with men's intestines, och hartkläder and firmly weighted, Hofnumana, with men's heads. Erudreikrenin, bloodstains spear serve, sorry, a little bit confused here. I should have read the whole poem and then translated. So let me go again. Okay, ja. Sjö orpin veffer ita thormum och harðkljáður hofnum manna. Eru dreirek indor at skoptum, jorn varður illir en orum hrælaður. So, the fabric is warped with men's intestines, and it is firmly weighted with men's heads. There are blood-stained spears who serve as heddle rods, the shed rod, an iron-bound axe, and the arrows are the pin beaters. So we have here a description of the activity of weaving, but then again you can see that the elements of the warp are actually parts of soldiers' bodies. So this is a very, very strong imagery here. It's pretty gruesome. Scullum slåss verdum sigr vefferthenna. Genger hildir veffa och hjorthrimul sangrider svippuls verdum tognum. Skapt mun nesta, skjolder mun besta, mun hjalmgangar ich liv koma. So here we also have a couple of names of these Valkyriur. So they say, with our swords we must beat this fabric of victory. Sigurvef. Hilder goes to weave, and Hjorthrimul, Sangrivel, Svipul, they weave with unsheathed swords. The shaft will break, the shield would shatter, the helmet hound, that would be the sword, will gnaw through armor. So you get the main point. The battle here is described using this weaving terminology, and it is also one of the best examples we have for presenting the activity of weaving. So not only for presenting the activity, the battling activity of the Valkyriur. So I think this is a pretty compelling image to see the Valkyries in action, and it also shows us, because the poem is probably kind of old, like in the 10th, 11th century, maybe, or even earlier. It shows us something I find very interesting, which is the fact that at the beginning, these Valkyriur were not really those beautiful, sexualized women men took as their companions in the afterlife, or were served by in the afterlife, but on the contrary, they were kind of gruesome and frightening, and this whole romanticized idea about the Valkyries could be a later concoction. So I would say this is kind of like what we had in the beginning, with these women actually provoking a lot of fear, but then they were kind of like tamed and domesticated, also part of a broader effort to convince men to go to war. So later on we can find glorious and militaristic imagery, but on the other hand we also see these Valkyriur taking pleasure in killing, and as we saw briefly in the poem Håkonarmál, there are hints of doubt about their choices, when the king says that we were worthy of gain from the gods, why did you take us away? We do have other poems, however, where we have other ideas about Valkyriur. We have Helga Kvíða Hjörvarssona, for example. This is a poem from the Poetic Edda, the collection of poems about gods and heroes written in the 1200s. And here we have this whole romanticized, tragic warrior woman ideal. This is also confirmed in other poems, such as Hrafsmál. This is a poem about an interesting conversation between a Valkyria and a raven, where we have, again, all kinds of ideas about beauty and wisdom, virginity also, and elegance associated with this kind of woman. So in the Poetic Edda, there's definitely a little more diversity regarding how people saw these Valkyriur, as well as in Eddic poetry. On the other hand, in the Prose Edda, that would be the attempt from the scholar Snorri Sturluson to organize a little bit more this mythology. We rather have a cliched fantasy figure who not only allots death and chooses the warriors, but also serves them and, generally speaking, tends to them. There is also another thing going on here. I mentioned before the overlapping with other figures such as the Nornir, because Snorri, for example, tells us that the youngest Norn, Skuld, also rides with the Valkyriur. So the Nornir, the Fates in Norse mythology, are generally speaking three: Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld. But in some cases, like with Skuld here, it could have been that the boundaries between these categories were not really that well defined. And besides that, besides the Nornir and Valkyriur, we also have other categories of mythological and supernatural women. We have the Disir, for example. The Disir were probably related to spirits, rather worshipped in a local context by families. And we also have the Fylgjur. Fylgjur being the so-called followers, or better said, fetchers. These could be spirit animals, but they could also be in the shape of a woman, and it was a part of the soul, a part of the Viking soul. And usually you're going to find them mentioned in the sagas in relationship to something ominous about to happen to the person. For example, if you saw your Filgia in a dream, that would have been a sign that you were about to die. All right, but coming back to the Valkyrie, so this whole idea of a romanticized female figure we get from the poems of Helgi. Helgi is one of the heroes from the cycle of the Volsungs, and we also have a hint at these figures' sexuality, because if you look at both poems, actually all three of them, there are three poems, Helga Kvidda Hjörvarssonar and the Helga Kvidda Hundingspanna 1 and 2, you're going to find Svava reincarnated as Sigrun, appearing as a protective figure for this Helgi guy. And she even has an important role in actually naming the hero. So she's involved in a name-giving theme, a name-giving ritual. She addresses the unnamed son of Sigurlin and Hjörvarth in the first Helgi poem, and then she becomes his protector in battle. So that's also something interesting to notice, that they're not always linked to Odin. Sometimes they can choose to get connected to a warrior. This is something you also find in Sami culture. For example, the idea of the spirit wife as an reincarnated lover. And in the Helgi poems, you also find this idea of reincarnation. And the connection is so strong that at some point after his death, Sigrun comes weeping at his burial mound, and Helgi comes back, and they do spend a romantic night together. So yeah, she spends a romantic night with her dead husband, but then he has to go back to Valhall, and he leaves her, and sometime afterwards she actually dies of sadness. So this is definitely a more romanticized ideas we have about these Valkyrie, which can also be called swan maidens or wish maidens, Oskmeyar. It's not very clear if it's the same figure meant here, but they do have some similarities on a structural level. But like I said before, at the beginning, there would have been a little more terror in this whole imagery of Valkyrie. For example, in Volsunga Saga in chapter 9, there is an interesting phrase. It is said that looking at them is as staring into a flame, as staring into fire. All right. They can also have some interesting functions alluded at in Skaldskaparmál, which is part of Snorri's work, the Prose Edda, in chapter 50. There is a fascinating reference to the never-ending battle, the Battle of Hjatningavik, where you have the Valkyria Hildur, and she's the daughter of Hogni, and she's the cause of this great battle where essentially nobody dies, and they all come back to life and fight again. And in this battle, she is joined by her father. In another version, we find the story as if Odin had ordained it and not her father. But anyway, she is the one who is also a sorceress and revives the dead, turns them into stone till the next day. So we can wonder if an Odinic healing function is mentioned here, because we in the sources we also have some allusions at Odin also having this shamanistic power to heal. What else can I say? I can say a little bit about the relationship to Freya. Freya is an interesting goddess. We usually tend to relate her to the idea of fertility and sexuality, but her character was definitely a little more complex than this. She shares a lot of elements with Odin, and we do have a source where it is stated that she even gets half of the warriors slain in battle. She's also related to this whole idea of flying, and she has that famous feathered clothing Thor also uses to get his hammer back. So she is definitely a more complex character than this whole idea of love and so on, marriage and family. She even seeks expertise in hidden knowledge, just like Odin does. She does that in the poem Hidljóð. So we can assume that there would have been some connection to Freya as well, although this connection is nowhere stated like in a very direct way. But she does share this characterization as lustful and greedy in stories such as Sörlaþátr, and there is also an instance in Lokasenna, which is basically a poem about Loki insulting all the gods, taking part in a banquet organized by Aegir, where he complains about, or he tries to insult her by essentially calling her a very lustful woman. And this characterization might be of later date. Um, Overall, we do have some very strong personalities here of Valkyriur mentioned, like these characters Svava, Sigrun, Hildir. Probably the most powerful one is Sigurdriva. Sigurdriva is the one who appears in a couple of poems from the cycle, from the heroic cycle of the Poetic Edda, and she's also probably the equivalent of Brynhildr in the saga of the Volsungs. Why is she the most powerful? Because in the poem and in the saga as well, although in the saga she does adopt a multitude of roles, but in the poem she is the one offering knowledge to the hero Sigurd. She talks a lot about powerful runes. She teaches him to use runes in different contexts, to cast spells and charms, and to protect himself. So if you are looking for Valkyriur in the sources, you're going to find, most of them, or a lot of them in sources of poetry, like the poem Grimnismál 13 appear in the description related to Valhall. Then you have them in the poems of Helgi, and you also have different lists of Valkyriur and of goddesses as well. Sometimes you can find them in both lists, and here you can find around 20 to 30 names of Valkyriur. So I would assume that with the passage of time, these characters eventually turned into what is deemed as a shield maiden, or skjaldmær. They also share a lot of characteristics with these characters, but shield maidens is a rather human figure, and the Valkyria a supernatural figure, although the difference is not really that clear. Shield maiden, we can also find maidens. We can also find in heroic poetry, in skaldic poetry like Haraldskvæði, Håkonarmál, in Eiríks saga Ráða, Ljósvendinga saga, and so on and so forth. Often they appear in legendary sagas, but these are later sagas, and the attitudes of the authors about women actually taking part in war is one which is very ambiguous. There are even bands of female warriors mentioned now and then, and so a variety of moral standpoints. So if you compare, for example, a source like Hervarasara or Heidrek, where we have the maiden Hervor who does something pretty extraordinary. She goes to her father's burial mound and requests from him the magical sword Tyrfing. Here, the author doesn't seem to be bothered a lot by this whole agency thing going on, by a woman actually taking part in a very male domain. But if you go to the saga of Hrolf Kraki, which is a later saga, is from the 14th century, there you're going to find a lot of women typologies, as a matter of fact, but you don't really have this kind of like accepting attitude towards them. Okay. Literary sources are not the only sources where you find Valkyriur or shield maidens. You can also, here there is not always 100% chance that we identify these figures correctly, but you can also look at picture stones. The picture stones from Gotland. You have this is, for example, the Tjengvide stone. You also have the Ledbrohammars stone, or the Lilbjer stone, and here you can find women figures wearing helmets or offering something to a warrior presumably entering Valhall. You can also find cast silver pendants with such figures, and the artistic conventions lead us to believe that they were in fact women wearing lances and swords and shields. And well, you also have some figures in the Oseberg burial, such as a woman with a bird head and one wearing a boar skin. So this is definitely food for thought. Wondering about the reality of these representations. But then again, you also need to take into account that, for example, this idea of offering a horn to a warrior, this is also related to a formalized notion of hospitality and of obligation. You're also going to find this in old English sources where women actually were in charge of, taking care of men, taking part in a banquet where they discuss warfare and different political matters. They had to tend to them, and they even had to praise them every once in a while and encourage them to go to war. And this connection between women and war, and well, in some way, I think you can interpret Valkyrie as some kind of personification for war. This is relevant if you look at the names of Valkyrie. It's most easily done here. So, for example, you're going to find references to spear, a lot of names with Geir, such as Geir Drivul, Geiravor, Geir Skull. So, generally speaking, weapon imagery, and names such as Gunnar Hilderklok or Skogul, referring to, again, warfare or noise or chaos and so on and so forth. So my conclusion would be that this figure was meant to tame war and to function as a means of convincing people to take part in such activities, and part of this whole semantic field of the afterlife promised to the warriors who had the courage to subject themselves to such torment and torture. But then again, we shouldn't forget that the connection to other kinds of deities like Disir, Nornir, or Filgur was also something that would have been pretty common. So I'm guessing you're wondering if we actually have some kind of references to women taking part in war in real life, so not only mythology. We do have some references, but I would say that they're very well. Uh, Minimal, fragmented, or inconclusive. The written evidence refers, for example, to an account by Ioannis Kilitzes. This is a Greek chronicle, a Byzantine chronicle. He speaks of a war taken place with the Rus, which was actually a mix of peoples from Eastern Europe. There were Scandinavians there and Slavs and all kinds of ethnicities. But I would assume in the beginning or in the middle of the 10th century, there would have been a strong Scandinavian element here. And he says that when checking the bodies after this battle in the mid 10th century, some women in full armor were found. Then we have some sources in the Irish world, the War of the Irish with the foreigners. We have here a reference to 16 flotillas attacking Munster, and one was led by the so-called Red Daughter. And we also find a reference regarding her sons who later die in Clontarf. Saxo Grammaticus also has a reference to a woman called Rusilla taking part in similar activities. So yeah, it is possible that a woman might have taken part in such battles, even leading one. So leading a boat, a combat ship in the Viking Age would have definitely been something extraordinary. There have also been some propositions about, maybe the chronicle uses this name Red Daughter or Red Maiden to actually refer to a man in a more or less insulting way. But I don't see why we couldn't consider this leader as being a woman. But I have to insist that this would have wouldn't have been kind of like a rule. It would have been rather the exception. The Annals of Ulster also mention some female commanders. They're also referred to as maids, and the Annals of Innisfallen, which I think exist only in a fragmented version in a later manuscript from the 17th century. So the context is quite unclear here. But these annals do mention some women in warfare context, and we can assume that it would have been a possibility. At any rate, when Vikings started raiding and when they would raid the British Isles, they would have also taken some other people with them. And not to mention that the raiders also had later on intentions to actually settle in these lands. So there would have been women with them performing different tasks. Well, not necessarily taking part in war, but helping with different activities around the war. Nevertheless, I would assume that sometimes it would have been possible especially in a crisis situation, or in a situation that was a little more complex, that women would have actually taken part themselves as like active members of such armies. There are some Danish women also mentioned by Abo in the besieging army on Paris in 885, but he rather refers to the fact that women are inciting men to take part in the battle, and encouraging them not to give up. There are also the legendary sagas I mentioned before, but these are quite problematic sources because they're late and they're filled with fantastical stuff, and also with a lot of chivalric elements. And then, of course, there is also the archaeological evidence, where we have the now famous Birka burial in Sweden. It's a grave that was excavated in late 19th century, and it was assumed, because of the weapons that were found, that it was a man's grave, but recent DNA analysis showed that it was actually a woman's grave. So there we have a very long-lasting debate, as is in the idea that were we actually dealing with a woman warrior? Was she actually an active warrior, or were these goods actually part of this whole idea of social status, and the um, actual use of the weapon is out of question, and we should focus on the symbolic value of a sword in a grave. So this is a complicated conversation because, well, if you find a man with weapons in a grave, you would automatically assume that he would have been a warrior. But then again, if you find a woman with a weapon in her grave, you automatically assume that maybe it was kind of like some treasure put there by people who buried her, and we should exclude this hypothesis that this woman actually took part in a war. So the possibility exists, but nothing really certain can be said about it. However, the way I see it from these sources, I think it's fair to say that in some contexts it would have been a possibility for women to actually take part in war, but not really on an extended scale. So on a scale that you see, for example, in the series Vikings, where you have these, I think, bands of women under the leadership of Lagertha, for example. I don't think that was really a thing. But in crisis situation, it is a possibility, which to me sounds like something we should accept. But well, on the other hand, I think that people focus a little bit too much on this idea of participating in men's activities with regard to warfare. So this is again a little bit problematic, because it says that women can gain status and can gain their own independence or autonomy if they partake in manly activities. But we should also take into account that if they really did that, that didn't really mean automatically that we are dealing with independent women. It would have mean, well, you break the boundaries, but you break the boundaries by engaging in men's activities. So it was not as if a woman activity such as milking or spinning became something well regarded or highly regarded in society. So the way to break boundaries in the Viking Age, and I think generally speaking in ancient societies, was this ability to partake in men's activities. And this is not something you only see with regard to the battlefield. This is something you also see, for example, in skaldic poetry. So to me, this is a little bit more fascinating, that this whole idea of participating in war. There are a couple of women poets, and if you have a woman poet who is mentioned by a masculine author, it really means that this woman was able to break this whole pattern, patriarchal pattern. So we have here Jorun Skoldmer, for example. We have Hildur Hroðsdóttir. We have Steinunn Refsdóttir. These are three names of women poets. And Jorun Skaldmer, for example, she wrote the biting message, Senbitir. It's preserved in the saga of Harald Fairhair, and also in Skóldskaparmál. So Snorri also mentions her, so she would have definitely been very talented. Hildur Hrolsdóttir, this is a woman we find in the saga of the island of Orkney, in Orkneyja saga. She's the daughter of Rolf Nevla, called Ragnhild, most probably, although in the Heimskringla, this is the source where we find the sagas of the kings. She is called Hild, and her father is said to have gone on Viking expeditions, and well, at some point he plundered Vik, and this aroused King Harald Fairhair's anger. He was banished. At this point, Hild appealed for clemency for her father, and she composed a skaldic stanza on this occasion. And we also have Steinunn Refsdóttir. She's mentioned in Kristi Saga and Olaf Saga Tryggvasonar and Mesta. Two skaldic verses are quoted here, where she taunts a missionary sent to Iceland by the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason. So I think we should, remember also that women did partake in other activities as well, dominated by men. And one of these activities, and was very highly regarded in society, was that of a poet, of a skald. And we have at least three examples of female poets. I think they were a lot more, but well, this is all that we have preserved, because authors writing were masculine, and they cared about promoting their own gender. And speaking about this, one role of women you are often going to find in the sources is that of the inciter, and this is also called the wetter. It's a role you find throughout Icelandic literature, throughout family sagas, legendary sagas, king sagas, and so on and so forth. You also find this in the heroes' lays, in the Eddas, and every now and then also in mythological poems. So this would have meant quite an important political tool for women who didn't really have political power, like de facto, but you could use some tactics in order to gain influence. And one of the methods of doing that was to incite to a feud, incite to war. Generally speaking, incite men do different things. That would have been a possibility, especially during migrations and periods of settlements. It's a figure resulting from different changes in Norse society, Norwegian Icelandic societies, because we have a developing feuding culture, and it is possible that storytellers sometimes may have attributed the feuds and the impossibility to solve the feuds to this figure of inciting women. So basically trying to find a scapegoat. So wetting as a political tool, useful for women in literature, but frowned upon by the authors dealing with this kind of stuff. The fact that it is frowned upon is reflected also in this aspect that is mostly associated with pagan behavior, because if you look at later sources, you're going to notice that this wetting thing, inciting thing, is rather absent from the last century of the Heimskringla, for example, when Christianity took hold. And we have some very, very interesting examples, speaking of the king sagas. So in Olaf Saga Helga, the saga of Olaf the Saint, we have actually two women named Sigrid, who are linked to the death of the king. So they egg their husband, respectively brother-in-law, to engage in some revenge, and they are made responsible for the disaster at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. So that's a pretty big deal to assume that women, by inciting their, one of them incites her husband to avenge her sons from a previous marriage, and the other one to avenge his nephew, but from the other secret, because these two women are related. It's a very complicated story, but to make them responsible for such disaster, for this battle, it would have definitely been a way for the author to explain the battle by using women as the scapegoats. And not only this battle is explained by means of incitement, we also find an example regarding the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000, also a very important battle in Norwegian history. And this is also explained by wetting at some point, because the saga tells us that Thiri, the wife of Olaf Tryggvason, and Sigurdur, the wife of the Danish king Svein, mm, would have taken part in the incitement, and this time Snorri, the author of the saga, takes inspiration from what a monk says, the monk called Other, and he tries to make Sigurd seem evil because she was refused marriage by Olaf, and this happened because he was pagan. So then Thiri eggs on Olaf that he doesn't dare to go south. Yeah, so we have here some kind of clerical misogyny going on, combined with mythical poetry and literary talent. Whenever we find such examples of, very complicated battles having taken part because of women, which was not really the case. Yeah, if you look throughout the material, you're also going to find other examples. In Orkneyja saga, for example, you have Ragnhild, who marries 3 brothers and eggs 2 nephews, to whom she offers herself actually to kill the first 2. So here you can also wonder, were these women that bad, or were the authors trying to make them look bad? And then we have perhaps the most well-known example of not only a woman inciter, but also a woman leader from the 10th century, whose career is well documented from skaldic poetry and early Norse and Latin writings. This is Queen Gunhild, and we have her referenced in the poem of Egil Skallagrimsson. He accuses her of inciting King Eric Bloodaxe to kill his brothers, and part of this image of her as not only a woman leader but also an evil sorceress also stems from the crop failures having taken place in the 10th century. And with the passage of times, she gets all these layers upon her. So she's cunning, and she's also pagan, and she's too beautiful. She uses magical powers to get her way, and so on and so forth. And she does have this wetting behavior, very, very conclusive, when she tries to persuade the king to have Egil immediately killed. But then again, the king doesn't really want to do that, and he instead accepts that Egil write a poem for him instead. And then she is so upset that she essentially calls Eric a bad king, because her wetting behavior comes to no avail. So you have here a potential model for other wetters. You have an element of historical background provided by some powerful women belonging to the ruling classes, which shows us that there would have been some methods to get involved in the political scene, and this image is reinforced by skaldic poetry on the one hand, and then the mistrust of Christian authors with regard to women taking place in political decisions. Another figure of a woman I really enjoy is the figure of the prophetess or the sorceress. And here we have a lot of examples, with the mention that while the prophetess is seen in a rather positive way, the sorceress, especially in later sources, were sources with a more prevalent Christian element, or rather seen in a negative way. So, in contrast to images of female warriors stemming to a great extent from male imagination, I would say prophetesses do have a very real social presence. They're involved not only in foresight, clairvoyance, but also in Seidr. So Seidr magic, it has a negative connotation, but this again is something rather influenced by later mentalities. Seidr had this shamanistic connotation of being able to manipulate the future, which was something very, very powerful at the time. And it was so powerful that you also have Odin as being the main agent of such sorcery. So it was definitely something very important, and it was something mostly performed by women, although men do tend to um, get involved with this kind of prophecy and magic as well with the passage of time. You can see references to prophetesses not only in the Viking Age. This is something quite ancient, but then again, we don't really know if the attributes or powers of these prophetesses would have been the same in, let's say, Greek and Roman sources talking about various Germanic tribes and the way they were perceived in the Viking Age. Nevertheless, I think it is relevant to remember that they were mentioned in ancient sources as well. So, for example, we have Strabo mentioning a Cimbrian priestess in white who poured the blood of prisoners in a vessel and examined their entrails, and she did that with no need for a male interpreting what she did. And then we have Tacitus, of course, with his writings on the Germanic tribes, saying that there is a sacred and prophetic quality in women, and they do not need the advice from others to do their forecasts. And Romans actually found it easier to control these tribes if they had women hostages, or at least this is according to what Tacitus says, not only in Germania but also in his histories. And he also mentions a couple of interesting figures, such as Veleda with divine attributions. She predicted the defeat of the Romans, and she was so powerful that she even represented the tribes in negotiations. And interestingly, she was kept on a high tower, which is something that we also have in the Viking Age. So when we see this kind of similarity, we can wonder if, maybe some seed, some root of this whole idea of prophetess could have been transmitted over a very extended time period. But then again, such connections are, well, kind of problematic because we're talking about like 1,000 years. um, right. um, anyway, we do find this figure in a lot of contexts. In Eddic poetry, for example, the best example is Sigurdrifa. I mentioned her before as a Valkyria, but she is also known as the wise woman, Visenda Kona, or Seid Kona. She is very powerful, and she knows how to use runes, for example, to cast spells. So I would assume that the Norse might have preserved a little bit of this memory of powerful women who could prophesize. We also have very interesting details in sources like the saga of Eric the Red. And I would say that because the saga is located in Greenland in the 11th century during a famine, we also have this connection with, well, certain Sami practices which might have influenced this approach to prophecy. And Neil Price has done some extraordinary work in investigating the relationships between the Sami practices and the possible Viking practices. So we have Thorbjörg in Erik Saga Rauda, who is a Volva. Volva is the term used in Norse for prophetess, and it is also a term you find in the very first poem from the Poetic Edda, the Voluspor, where Odin himself seeks the help of a Volva in revealing the future. So this was indeed a position of high status. You can also find the name sporkona used for that. So from the verb to foresee, usually meaning these women who would attend feasts and tell about the fates of individuals, or more largely speaking about harvests or crops, for example, which was something very relevant and important at the time. Um, yeah, so rituals involve charms and staffs and females who can sing the Vardlokur, which were apparently some kind of pagan chants. We don't really know much about them, but in the saga of Eric the Red, for example, the prophetess Torbjörg cannot perform the ritual without these chants, because apparently they invoke some kind of natural spirits, naturur, who reveal a lot. And by using these spirits, by using these natural spirits, she is capable of predicting the season. Um, they become at some point, I think, stock characters in the sagas because we often find them like referred to in a very brief manner. They just go around and predict the future in a very casual manner. So maybe later they would have only become literary figures, and they would have been divorced from the pagan past. However, I do think that they were at least part of the image people had in the medieval times about the Viking past. So if you look at what's going on in the laws later on, church legislation, there would have definitely been a lot of female magical performance in old Norse society. But then again, I think most likely dreams and premonitions would have been a little more common to interpret after Christianization. And speaking of Christianization, there was this tendency of, well, the attempt to transfer to men some of the attributes of these volur, like I said, with the interpretation of dreams, for example, because in pagan times, men performing magic, although they would have done that too, it came with a social price, because they would have been considered less masculine that they should have been. The accusation of ergi was something to take into account if you were a man and if you were willing to engage in sorcery. Mm, and you are also going to find this attempt to mix up sorcery with Christian practices. There is a story about Olaf Tryggvason again, visiting a prophet in Cornwall, who tells him about his wounds in the upcoming attack, but he explains this prophecy through the word of God. So the Christian context, we can say it made the soothsayer function acceptable by using this kind of reference that, you can make prophecy as long as you say the prophecy is from God, and you just separate it from the pagan context. Anyway, I would say that volur had one of the most important roles in the Viking Age. If you are a woman, it would have been comparable to a skald, and the visiting Sporkona would not only predict the future but also influence, or at least she was expected to do so. So this is also suggested by a short story called Norna Gestens Thotter, about a man condemned to live for centuries, and he says he remembers very clearly the age when the Volur had this power of not only predicting destiny but also influencing it. I would guess that it was also a professional status, because we have several examples where people make offers to the Volur to perform the ritual. Even Odin gifts a jewel to the Volva he evokes from the dead in order to gain knowledge. However, the same sources tell us to not to be so trustworthy of these characters. This is something we find in Voluspor, again the prophecy of the seeress, first poem of the Poetic Edda, where we find the prophetess Heather, and it is said that she is the favorite of all wicked women. This is also an allusion to the brides of giants. It's also something said about the giantesses. But yeah, in the sense that if a Volva made you a very positive prophecy, if I may say so, it would have been a sign that maybe it wasn't that positive, and maybe it was just the social expectation, because they were also expected to say something that would reassure you that the future is, bright. So be suspicious of the Volva who prophesizes only good. This is also something we find in the sayings of the High One, in the sayings of Odin in Hovamol in stanza 87, because, well, she's expected to do that. There is an element of isolation here, an element of liminality, because we find these Volur, as well as other female figures, I would say, the Nornir, for example, in places which are, well, between worlds. In Baldur's Traumar, in the Dreams of Baldur, we have a burial place near the gates of hell for a Volva. By the time of the sagas, especially the legendary sagas, this function of ritual assurance, reassurance, would have been something pretty common. And we have here some examples. From the saga of Hrolf Kraki, I mentioned before. The saga of Hrolf Kraki, we find here a Volva called Heather. And this Volva is called upon by the king Frodi, who wants to find the children of his blood, of his brother Halfdan, who he had killed, and he wants to find the children too, to make sure that he can remain leader, and he cannot do so unless he gets rid of the kids as well. And in order to do so, in order to find out where these children were hidden, he calls Heather, and the source tells us the following. And the king asked her to use her art and to say what she could learn about the boys. And he had a magnificent feast prepared for her coming, and he set her upon a high seat, platform. This would be Seidhjal. The king then asked what she could do to see the future. And she said, because I know, he said, that now much will be made clear to you, and I see you have great luck about you, so answer me as fast as you can. So he really pushes her to give him an answer. And the Volva does so. She wrenched open her jaws and yawned deeply, and this chant emerged from her mouth. Hon slärtho sundur kjattino geisparmjok och vard lidro muni. And then she begins to sing about what would have happened to these boys. And she actually reveals that the children were in hiding. But then when she tries to reveal that, we have Signy, who is her sister, if I remember well, and she tries to turn around the prophecy by throwing a jewel, a ring at her, and then she attempts to stop the prophecy or to twist it a little bit. King Frodi becomes very angry, and he threatens her with torture, and eventually the Volva reveals that the kids were in fact named differently now, and eventually he will get killed by them. So she was forced into the prophecy, but then again, it was not a prophecy to the king's liking. So, in other words, you have this idea of passive prophecy, but you also have the idea that perhaps there was also some magical influence involved here. Mm, Another interesting thing I've noticed is that in the the sagas of Icelanders, at least, you tend to have at some point an equal distribution between men and women, which indicates that there might have been a change in prestige, and this whole thing about men being regarded as arger if they performed magic as not masculine enough would have faded with time. However, women did seem to have initially dominated the scene. They engaged in magical knowledge. They used magic quite actively, and this is something that we not only find out from Old Norse sources. We also have some references from the Burgundian law, for example, from the Lombard law, where um, a wife could have been put away for witchcraft, for example. This was in the Burgundian law, and in the Lombard law, women under guardianship could not be accused of witchcraft. So this is, well, more or less the material that's going to become the source for witchcraft and witchcraft accusation in the Middle Ages, or in the late Middle Ages, better said. Adam of Bremen, for example, which is a very Christian source, condemns the North for being filled with magicians, which he calls malefici, divini, and magi. And this is not quite gender specific. Mm, in the sagas of the Icelanders, you could use magic, or well, a woman being able to perform magic, or even a man, if you had desired to influence a battle, for example. The recipients of this influence were usually men, since conflicts were very, very volatile. And this reminds us a little bit of the questions addressed to Veleda, thousand years, more than 1,000 years earlier, as mentioned by Tacitus, for example. Mm, Specific knowledge needed in sorcery created a space for male manifestation as well, yet women outperformed men in several kinds of magic. So you could, as a woman engaging in sorcery, you could provide even weapons for protection. You could also provide invisibility, according to some sagas. And there is this general idea that women would have been a little more in control of this whole thing. And this is something you not only see in the sagas, you also see it in the Book of Settlements in Landoma book. And this might have to do with the idea that men were perhaps newcomers in this domain. In the King sagas, we do have some magicians appearing in groups, also in a Christian context. We have an anecdote about King Olaf Tryggvason burning 80 magicians. And in the legendary sagas, we do tend to identify more and more magic with evil. We also have more male performers. The old term fjolkunninger, knowledgeable in the sense of knowledgeable in magic, is still used, although we do have other terms which are a little more derogatory, like trollskapper, and an expansion of the use of magic, sometimes just referring to controlling the weather. So this seems to me that it wasn't really that well integrated in society, or this whole idea of a man magician would have not been that integrated in society, as well as the woman figure. And there were thus a um, different strategies in order to determine men to take part more in this whole story. Um, Women also sought access to the technique of writing, writing in runes. Knowledge of runes would have also been something related to magic, but not in the sense that the rune meant they were magical, but in the sense that you could write and cast a spell or a curse by using script. So this would have also been something to learn for a woman in order to be even more powerful as a sorceress. All right, so if you look at the best source you have for the performance of magic by women, it is inevitable that you go to the saga of Eric the Red. And the saga of Eric the Red, essentially in this episode about sorcery and prophecy, prophecy rather than sorcery, describes a spåkona, a prophetess called Litilvolva, the little prophetess, and it is described in detail what she does in order to perform her prophecy. So the text talks about Thorbjörg and her custom to spend the winter attending feasts. It is said that she was also invited to these feasts because people were curious about what the future held in store, especially if it was a crisis situation such as a famine. And the saga goes to a great great lengths to describe what was actually going on here, and we find a lot of elements. And because there are so many elements here, there is also the suspicion that maybe some of them are not really that uh, pagan or that reminiscent of the Viking Age, but some, I would say a lot of the elements do have correspondences with other sources, and they are actually quite realistic. So it is said, for example, that the high seat was prepared for her with cushions and so on and so forth, and it's also uh, presented. We also find presented here the way she was dressed. She wore a string of glass beads around her neck. She wore lambskin hood lined with white cat skin. She had a staff in her hand with a knob on it, and around her waist she had a belt of tinder wood on which there was a large leather pouch where she kept her charms that she used for sorcery, termed here as froðleikir. She had hairy calfskin shoes on her feet with sturdy laces, and on her hands she wore catskin gloves, which were white inside and furry. And everyone was supposed to offer her respectful greetings when she came inside. Again, an allusion to the high social status she had, which she received according to her opinion of each person. So, in order to avoid a bad prophecy, you would have probably had to treat this woman very, very well. Then we have a very large description. I won't go into details about what people do, what kind of food is prepared for her, and what she does, how she spends the night. And eventually, after Thorkel, who needed this prophecy, prepared everything she needed, the women formed a circle. So she had some assistants as well. This is also important. So this idea of performing a prophecy and also spells in kind of like a collective manner. So the women formed a circle around the platform, on top of which was this woman Thorbjörg, and Gudrid then chanted the chants so beautifully and well that no one could say that they had heard anyone recite a more um, lovely voice. And then the Spokana thanked for her chant and said that many Nauturur had been drawn there, so natural spirits, the spirits of the land. Landvetir is also a term to be found in relationship to that. And everyone was working towards the ending of the famine, essentially. So she predicts that the famine is going to be over and the next season would be quite fruitful. And after this whole thing, the people went to the Visendakona, to this knowledgeable woman, and everyone would ask what they badly needed to know. And yeah, there was quite admiration for this woman and of the practice of pagan prophecy. And this is something you also find in many other sources, but not as detailed as here. Mm, in conclusion, with regard to prophecy and sorcery, it is possible that initially women were the one who had here a say, and with the passage of time, more and more men sought to kind of like infiltrate this domain, and um, in an attempt as well to rob the practice of certain elements that were valid in pagan times. So the idea of the wise man was something now coming to life, um, especially before the 17th century. But this should not obscure the fact that in pagan and at least in early medieval times, wisdom would have been the specialty of the vulva and of the female magician. If you look at bands of sacrifices and of magic, we find a couple of them, for example, in the Grey Goose Law in Grogos. You are going to find that women sometimes are not automatically credited with this whole idea of being able to perform prophecy or magic, but with the idea that it's somehow external, and it's not something a woman herself causes. This is one thing, and another way of detaching the woman from this important role was to use other terms in order to be a little more insulting. So for example, they would stop using the older terms and use forndeida, for example, which was an insult to men, but in the sense that they were performing female or engaging in female behavior. So it's kind of like the usage of sexual insults in order to make both men look bad, but also their initial performers, who were the women. So this is all very compelling and interesting. Being engaged in activities having to do with warfare or sorcery or telling people the future and so on. But we are missing out on perhaps the most important role women had in the Viking Age and beyond the Viking Age, which was essentially working. Women worked, and they worked a lot, and without their work, the functioning of society was endangered. And everyone needed to work together, especially in a place with a cold climate and with such harsh conditions, because if you didn't do that, your household was endangered. And we have the term hyon used in the sense of household, so not necessarily family, but everyone taking part in the daily activities in the chores. So women had to be present in farms. If you didn't have a wife, you should have gotten a housekeeper, a so-called matselia, or both a male and female manager. That was also something that could have happened. There are many references to women taking over farms and managing them. The housekeeper was a chief position. However, with the passage of time, some male titles also take over. So, Brit is a term we find in the sense of manager of a farm, of a larger farm. Then we have the wives of bishops, for example, held a special position. Um, and this shows us that regardless of the age, the goal was to establish a strong and independent household, and in doing so, you really needed the women to take part in this whole process. The general rule would be that women had to take care of the affairs within the house, and this is clearly specified in the laws, in the law codes, by using the term "fyrir innan stock," which essentially means within the borders of the house, within the house's threshold. The masculine domain seems to have been outside, for example, sewing, but in the sagas, it's more likely a backdrop for some events which would have been a little more important. So that's why such activities, whether performed by men or for women, are not really that well represented, because, or at least sagas, they were very much concerned with feuding and political conflicts and so on and so forth. So this whole laboring, so what happens in the backdrop, like kind of stayed in the backdrop. It was not the essential point here. So it was not something to be concerned with. The law codes, on the other hand, were concerned with the transfer of property and less with agriculture or how people performed whatever they performed. But there are references to fertilizing, for example, to the importance of manure and hay. Also, fence building seems to have been very important, branding animals and driving animals to pastures, as well as other activities related to husbandry, like the cleaning of the stalls. We find these in the section of the Grey Goose Law describing what activities were permitted or not during holidays or during fasting. So yeah, we do have this difference between male and female regarding of who did what in the household. However, women were involved in the male domain by processing and converting the raw products. And also dairy operations seem to have been something women were rather concerned with. And by this I mean milking in the barn and during summer in cottages in the highlands. Um, Making fire, slaughtering animals, even brewing beer, and of course mending clothes. This is something women would have also been engaged with. Um, when we make the distinction between what men and women did, we should also have in mind that work was also conditioned by social status. So, mm, um, women could have engaged in male tasks if they were of lower social status. An example with this for this would have been like pulling a boat. Pulling a boat would have been a male task. It's also very physically challenging, but in reality, you would assume that women, servant women of lower social status, would have also been dragged into such an activity, and this is just an example. So the wealthier women were expected to stay home, and many were accustomed with these tasks because, for example, in the saga of Njol, this is just one example. The last night of the hero Gunnar in the story says in the episode it is stated that everyone was out for the harvest and only Gunnar and his wife and his mother stayed home. So there was a clear distinction between high status and lower status, and this was valid even in more, let's say, more egalitarian societies such as the Icelandic one. Um, with regard to the activity of gathering, if you look at cross-cultural comparisons, you would say that perhaps women might have been in charge, most likely, and men dealt with physically challenging tasks like the carving of whales. And in the sagas, this would have also been a little more interesting story to tell, because when men find a stranded whale on a beach, this would also have involved some kind of conflict for resources, and it would have been great material, storytelling material to develop a plot around a feud. Mm, but women were involved in essential activities such as milking. And sometimes the whole household would move to the pasture, and the housewife could accompany a shepherd while the husband was attending the Althingi. And by the 15th century, there was a professionalization of this, let's say, job. We have an expectation to milk 80 ewes a day, and in the huts, you essentially only separated the milk into curds. You continued with this whole activity back home. So it was definitely very challenging and also essential. Other activities include laundry. This would have occurred in streams. Of course, was much easier to perform in Iceland, where you also have hot springs. This was also enforced by the Christian expectation to have clean clothes on Sundays. So they used a beater, poles, lines. We don't really have a lot of details about this. Then again, women were expected to provide body services within the house, and body services would have meant everything from washing hair to sexual availability, waiting men at the table, undressing others. So such menial jobs remain largely unnamed by expressing them with a passive voice, for example, in the stories, but they were there at any rate. Otherwise, preparation of food was also something women did. We have grinding, for example. We have archaeological evidence for millstones, and this is also something referred to in a mythological tale in the poem Grottasöngor, where two giant women are forced to grind gold from a magic millstone, but then they get really upset because um, they don't get a break from the king, and they instead summon an army using this millstone. So this is also pretty relevant story. At any rate, then we have the making of butter. Butter was also extremely important in this society. Butter was heavily salted and could have been kept for decades, used to soften fish. It was also very prestigious. For example, in the saga of Njol, we have Gunnar having difficulties after a great famine when he shared his stores with others, and his wife Hatelgerder sends a servant to steal cheese, but then suspicious Gunnar replaces these cheeses with meat. So in the story, meat was actually of lower status than butter and cheese. We also have a lot of references to the rooms or stores where these activities of preparing food would have been performed. We have the term eldhús, for example, which means in Icelandic, in contemporary Icelandic, it means kitchen, but it was not the only one. Other texts mention specifically a cooking house, and maybe they were all related to the necessities for each kind of food, because sometimes you could serve them directly from a pantry and sometimes you couldn't. Utibur is also something we find mentioned quite a lot, actually more frequently than a simple kitchen, because this was a storage room and it was also used for war equipment, and it was also used for serving the function of sheltering others. So because men were also involved in this, it would have been something more often mentioned in the sources. And last but not least, the textile work, spinning and weaving. Um, the female role in Icelandic material culture, at least, is highlighted by the ubiquitous presence of homespun vadmol, which was produced from sheep's fleece. And this would have involved creating a lot of stuff: bedding, sails, wall hangings, packs, all sacks. So all kinds of things. Mm, the information about the actual process we don't really have. We have information about the measurements and economical value, but how they performed it was again something that was rather assumed, and it was not really detailed in the stories. But like I said, was an extremely important activity. I have a separate video on this. I actually presented it at a conference last year for the Save Ancient Studies Alliance about the symbolic meaning of weaving as well. So if you're interested in this topic, you can go there and find a little more about, for example, the relationship between weaving as a material activity and this symbolic significance related to fate and weaving fate. At any rate, in a very mundane manner, we can say that the Viking Age wouldn't have occurred without this um, material culture, because, for example, if you look at sails, Viking sails, we have textile research which actually measured how much would have been needed for that. And the calculations show, for example, for the Leadby ship, that 2-person years of 10-hour day were needed to make just one sail, and take into account that you also needed some kind of backup if something went wrong. And if you add clothing, rugs, tents, ropes, and so on and so forth, that was estimated at a year's constant work for 30 people to fully equip a ship. And by the 10th century, the total requirements of the warships and cargo vessels as well amounted to 1 million square meters of material. So this was an extraordinary task, and it would have been something absolutely essential for Viking expeditions to take place. There are a few references to this. We have an Icelandic skald who refers to sails spun by women, and we also have an example of a king being presented as a gift with longship sails. So to underline the importance of this activity. This was not the only thing they did. They were actually very inventive. They even invented or developed a fur substitute for the first settlers in Iceland by experimenting with a novel weaving technique. And they created the shaggy clothing, or the shaggy pants. So something that could have that was spun and woven, but it gave you the impression that it was actually fur or something like that. At any rate, it was also used as currency in Iceland and accepted abroad. It was exchange for supplies not available on the island, and it was also used instead of silver because the quantities of silver were very limited. So women's work was absolutely essential in ensuring the functioning of society, both from an economical point of view and from a cultural point of view. If you want to know more about women in Old Norse society, because unfortunately I was only able to provide a very broad overview, I will try to do more and upload it on my YouTube channel, or maybe write some articles about that. But if you want to study on your own, I do recommend two books: Old Norse Images of Women and Women in Old Norse Society. They are both written by author Jenny Joshens, and she describes here several aspects of Norse society from the point of view of women and the activities of women. So that was it from me today. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to know more about Old Norse culture and its many dimensions, please give me a subscribe at Irina Skuld. You can find me on YouTube easily. I post there regularly, and I hope this has been somewhat interesting and useful for you. And now you know a little more about what women did in the Viking Age than before. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Irina. As always, that was wonderful. I just wanted to mention, because you mentioned a few things during your stream about like our virtual conference and stuff like that. So we are accepting abstracts for our virtual conference right now. So if you're interested in submitting an abstract to present at our virtual conference, as Irina mentioned she did in the past, those are open until the end of March. Also, like, check back, because Irina will definitely be coming back on for more master classes, potentially in April, and definitely doing one during our birthday bash at the beginning of May. So we're very excited to have her back for that. And again, there is a playlist on our YouTube channel that has her past master classes that she streamed with us. I think there's 3 or 4 of them on there right now. And this one will be saved there too. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Again, if you like what you see, please scan the QR code or search Save Ancient Studies Alliance. We try to do things in all different fields of ancient studies. So Irina is kind of our veteran Old Norse person at this point, which is great. So yes, thank you very much for joining us. We will see you again probably within the next few weeks with another masterclass with Irina.
Yep.
And on that note too, please do message us or Irina of things that you'd be interested to learn about too. We always want to meet people where they're at and teach them about things that they actually want to learn about. So definitely feel free. Follow Irina also on basically every platform. Find her on YouTube to find this recording as well. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.
Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.